Hello, I'm Frank Stanishi, and welcome to Open Forum. It's always candid, frank, and live. Welcome to the Spanglish World Network on Zingo TV, channel 250. Please remember to download the Zingo TV app at the respective app stores for iOS and Android devices. While you download, make sure you rate and leave a comment. Both apps are absolutely free. Zingo TV is available on Google Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Fire TV sticks, Roku sticks, and also on all smart TVs 2016 forward. Now joining me on Open Forum, Shelley Brown. He is going to be the candidate as an Ontario Liberal for York Centre. I want to wish you a blessed Passover and a happy Easter. I hope you're having a good one so far, and hope you have a great one on the weekend.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, of course. Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about you and who you are. Your biggest, I guess, the biggest thing I can say about you is you were a human rights lawyer, labor lawyer, very entrenched in what rights we have as people within this country.
Well, yeah, that's my background. I've certainly practiced law now for 40 some odd years. It's difficult for me to say that number. And for the most of it, it's been as an employment law lawyer. And my predominant client base was employees. And I did related human rights law as well. And therefore very comfortable with the Ontario Human Rights Code and the protections it affords to employees and other individuals. So that's my background from a professional standpoint.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I'm sure it has had an impact on your future and your future endeavors, which politics is one now. Mm-hmm. How has human rights changed in your mind in the 40 years that you've been involved?
Well, I think people are more sensitive to it, and I'm thankful for that because, quite frankly, we have a society where there are stratifications in terms of where people are and their positions in society, and I think that we need to protect certain people who are marginalized or don't have the same resources as those in the employment area and the employer area. And so I think that that sensitivity, that knowledge of where their rights are, I think are very important.
Yeah, I guess if I were, as a person who isn't in the legal system, just as a person who's lived life, human rights now is something more or less that is a blank page with a set of values on it. And now you take people, depending on where they're sitting and where they come from, and all these other effects or causes that they have in their background. Has it become simpler to teach people what human rights are? Because we along with the changes that Canada's gone through, and I'm sure with what you did, people from different countries have different attitudes. How did that impact on human rights as far as you're concerned, as far as expectations and delivery is concerned?
Well, that's a very wide-ranging question. I think
we got an hour.
I'd like to do it more quickly than that, but I think that it's not a question of. I think it's a question of being able to provide the rights to ensure that people who need to have access to the courts and the justice system are able to have that access and know where they need to go in order to protect themselves if they've been wronged. And so that really is the most significant aspect of this whole thing. I think there needs to be access to justice. I think people need to be able to afford an attorney if they do need to have an attorney. I think they also need to have the resources to be able to access the tribunals, the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, for instance, and thereby redress whatever wrongs were done to them, whatever infringements of the code were acted upon. And so that's really where things need to be focused. That's where people need to have certain protections.
Now, you're a person, who isn't just a linear. You have a wide-ranging bit of experience. You're also a singer and musician and writer. Tell us a little bit about that and how that fit into your life.
Well, my parents wanted me to become a violinist, and so I practiced. I played violin for 8 years. During that period of time, I also picked up the guitar and started playing guitar and writing songs. And I went to France, and I was playing outside in the streets of France, and somebody from inside a bar came out and said, "Who's singing that song?" And for all intents and purposes, I was quote unquote discovered in France. I was on French radio. I did some recording in France, and when I came back to Canada at the time, I was living in Montreal. There was somebody I knew who was a producer for the CBC, and I signed a record deal with him. He also got me to do a couple of broadcast recordings for the CBC. I had a few shows that where I was featured on the CBC, and so that was the essence of my background in music. For a couple of years, I did that, and it was really interesting, really exciting.
So you have a social background with the legal experience,
Mhm.
and you have, as far as music is concerned, a cultural background. And when I say this, I'm speaking from the perspective of as a human being and to be a politician. We'll
Mhm.
move on to the political side now. So now you have those two things. Where does the political side fit into those other two versions of Shelley Brown?
Well, I think actually the political side is more aligned to my professional life, because I saw the effects of marginalization, disparity of resources, power differentials in terms of the employment law that I did, and so I felt that that was important to bring into the political sphere, because I felt that the legislative aspect, even the judicial aspect, didn't always protect the people that needed to be protected. And so, as I said, access to justice is very important. And I think at the political level, you have more of an impact to ensure that people who need legal advice and legal representation, access to the courts, will be able to get that access and be able to exercise their rights. Because as the saying goes, a right that can't be exercised is no right at all.
Now there's where, I guess as a politician, as a musician, uh, as a human rights lawyer, I was in the business of construction, and we had this green book. And it's basically Ontario um,
Mhm.
safety guide, right, for
Mhm.
for work. And we always used to say, and we always were expected. One of the first lessons I was taught: you don't have to memorize the book. You just need to know where to find stuff. How can you help people find the answers to what they're looking for, and what are the questions? I guess we could go through them one by one. As you decided to be a liberal, why a liberal?
Well, I think that the liberal philosophy is such that it's best aligned to bringing in all areas of our society to be able to deal with the problems that we have. So those people on the right are more libertarian in focus, more focused on the marketplace, and that's their natural sort of tendency, natural leaning in terms of what is going to fix whatever problems they feel exist in society. Those people who are more progressive and on the left are more aligned to a more leftist viewpoint, and that's their natural tendency is to go to that in terms of addressing whatever problems they feel need to be addressed. I think both have legitimacy, but they're too mutually exclusive. I think you need to have a middle ground. It could be a progressive middle ground, but something in between the two that will ensure that you bring in all areas of society in order to deal with the problems that we have. And that I think that the Liberal Party and the liberal philosophy is best aligned to be able to handle those particular issues and respond to them.
I guess I could use three phrases here: hand out, hand up, you're on your own. Does that describe the three political parties?
Well, I don't like doing that. I
I,
just it's too.
because that's the argument. That's what each one calls the other, right? Essentially, that's the definition they give for each other. If you're a conservative, the other two are either a handout or they won't admit it's a hand up. there is a difference, because as a liberal, you're caught in between, as you described,
Mhm.
two parties. One
Mhm.
one that basically says, "Leave us alone, we'll handle it," which is the Conservative Party. Essentially, that's its root. Whereas where you have the NDP, who figure you need help, we should give the Green Party a little love too. Uh, Supposedly they're into the
Mhm.
environment. So
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
as a liberal, you're kind of in the middle, more of a centrist. Do you think centrist thinking today is working? The world is it's pretty strange the way things are going, populists and things like that going on. Can you your party rule and do what needs to be done to the people's expectations? Because that's the biggest challenge politicians have today, is expectations.
I think absolutely it can. That's the first answer. The second thing is that expectations sometimes exceed what the reality may be. But I want to go back to one of the things that you were talking about in terms of those three levels: the hand up, the
Go ahead.
hand and the last one, which escapes me at the
That
moment.
was an unfair. Those were just simple definitions.
I,
That's all. I hope.
I hear you,
Yeah.
but that what that does is it negates the fact that even within the extremes, and I don't find them that extreme necessarily, but
Right.
even within those extremes, there are nuances, and so but the problem is that to align yourself with a particular party or a particular movement that is identified with a particular constituency, it's more difficult to have those nuances acted upon. And I think those nuances are what's necessary in order to address the problems that we have. And so, yes, there is a lot of polarization. That is a problem, particularly when you have a party that's more aligned to either the left or the right side of the spectrum. When you have a party that is open to other ideas, you're going to have those ideas part of the solution. And that's the issue here. And that's why I'm a liberal.
So a bigger umbrella.
Partly, yeah, absolutely. I think if you just look at the makeup of the Liberal Party, you can see that it's very reflective of our society, or Ontario in general. I mean, it's very diverse, and from all sorts of positions, right? I mean, in terms of age, in terms of ethnic background, cultural background, racial background, socio and economic background. All of those elements are there that represent Ontario.
Yeah, and Ontario is a very diverse province,
Hmm.
and it's also diverse within itself.
Hmm.
Because of the highly populated Toronto, and where immigration seems to be very strong. And I'm not suggesting it in a positive or a negative way. Just that it's a reality that you have different types of people in Toronto than you do, let's say, if you go in Northern Ontario. How does the Liberal Party, as a you're going, at least you're trying to be the representative for York Centre,
Hmm.
how does your community that you're in fit in your mind, and what you can do? Because I sometimes wonder, because at this point it's hard, because we don't really have the platform yet. Your leaders, you know, leader Del Luca hasn't yet, posted exactly what they're going to offer. So, from your perspective, as best you can, what do you see in your community that your voters need to hear from you, and ensure that they understand what you want to do for them that's good for them?
Well, first, when I first came to Toronto, I was a resident of this riding. My kids went to Leobec. I know the riding. I've been working in this riding for 20 plus months, first to get the nomination, and learning what people's hopes and fears and desires were for the future. And I chose York Centre to be my riding because of its incredible diversity. I think that it is really representative of Toronto, because Toronto is the most cosmopolitan city in the world, and Ontario, generally speaking, and truthfully, if you want to go further, Canada as such. I think that it is if you deal with the issues that are significant to each of the demographic groups within York Centre, you're dealing with what's necessary to make life better for all Ontarians, and because we have all Ontarians represented in York Centre, and each one of them has a vibrancy and has made a contribution and has an issue relating to the nature of their particular culture within Ontario. It's if you deal with all of those varieties and variations, you're actually dealing with what Ontario represents and what York Centre represents, and that's why I feel the Ontario Liberal Party is the best suited, because it actually reflects what York Centre is all about.
While we talk right now, we'll talk about issues. And when I say the first issue, it's not necessarily, over and above the most important thing for Ontarians to consider, or the Liberal Party, or you as a candidate to consider. But let's start with the first issue. In your mind, what is a primary concern for Ontarians today?
Well, the overriding concern, without any question, is the future. And just making sure that whatever plans, whatever programs, whatever policies are put in place represent what's necessary for the future. And the fundamental foundation for all of that is education. That's the only way that we're going to meet the needs of the future economy, the environment, healthcare, ensuring that the next pandemic will be handled appropriately, is if we recognize what the needs are in terms of education for the future. We have to educate our children to be able to deal with the new economy that is happening, the green economy, the new technologies that are coming forward. Dealing with the environment and all of the changes that are going to be necessary to be made and to react to. All of that focuses exclusively, in my view, or predominantly on education. We need to have that, and we do not have that now. We do not have that. What we have is a reactive government that looks at the problem after it's happened and says, and frankly, does not even do enough to be able to redress what has already happened. I think we need to look forward and say, what are the lessons that we have learned from what's happened in the past couple of years, and make sure this doesn't happen again. What is the type of technology we want for the future? How do we get these people interested in coming and investing in Ontario? We have to have an educated workforce so that they would want to come into Ontario, so they'll have workers to be able to deal with these things. What do we need from a healthcare standpoint in the future? We need to have a plan going forward. None of this is happening with respect to Doug Ford. Doug Ford reacts, he doesn't proact.
Well, in fair, just to be fair, if I can be the devil's advocate here,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what happens when and if you guys get elected, I'll say the same thing again, because it's something I'm going to keep repeating in my life. I've learned that every party that takes over, control of the government, whether it be city, provincial or federal government, every one of them inherits something.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of the pandemic, the Ford government inherited the pandemic, inherited our lack of understanding of, if it happens, we should be ready for it. Pre-planning. There was very little pre-planning that I think all of Canada was guilty for. Tell me the opposite.
Actually, the opposite really is what the reality is. The fact is that there was a lot of indication from people like Bill Gates, right?
Right.
As well as within the Wynne government, that had a plan and had a structure notionally in place that was gutted by Doug Ford when he got into power. Now, I acknowledge the fact that we weren't aware that there was going to be a pandemic as such, but when the pandemic happened, there was very little done to learn from what happened in China, to learn from what the government and the scientists started learning about. So I acknowledge that for a period of time, we were all learning as we went along. But that learning phase did not last for 4 years. That learning phase did not last, I'm sorry, for 2 years. That learning phase did not even last for 6 months. We were learning and truthfully learning as we went along. And I'm suggesting to you that Doug Ford did not learn the lessons that were happening during the course of the pandemic. And so there was very little change. There was a lot of catch up. And each time we had to catch up, that we had to catch up, it actually was at the expense of people's lives and people's livelihoods going forward. I mean, look, the cuts that Doug Ford made at the beginning of his tenure, right, seriously compromised how well we could react to the pandemic going forward. And the event and the ultimate outcome shows that this is what occurred.
Don't disagree. In fact, the cuts that you're referring to aren't just ones that he made. They go back almost generations. I can remember the cuts that have happened. The point being, I guess, that the biggest lesson might it not be our ability, our hospital system, our ability to handle illness in larger numbers than it was able to. We have a very is it something that now you believe your party understands that there has to be an ability for our healthcare system to handle sick people in bulk over a short period and, be reflexive as opposed to unable to handle, all the different hospital beds that need to be created at a moment's notice?
Absolutely. But I think even more so, the Liberal Party is now sensitive and aware of the fact that we can't let it get to the point, right, without at least reacting to it, to the point where we're in that type of, dangerous dynamic. And truthfully, there has to be, it's very simple. We could have tested, we could have traced, we could have vaxxed, and we could have masked. Those were the four things that were always there from day one and were never implemented in any consistent manner by Doug Ford. My party, the Liberal Party, knows of those four things. It's aware of how they interact within the context of a pandemic, how they protect against the continued spread, and certainly that's going to be the modus operandi of the Ontario Liberal Party if it gets into power, and I think it should, to make sure that this doesn't happen again, that it doesn't get to the levels that it got to with Doug Ford. And he only reacted to it after the fact, after the point where it was so scary, and nurses whose salaries were capped at 1% gave up their lives, both metaphorically as well as actually in many instances, in order to make sure that we still were able to function. And truthfully, a lot of the procedures that were not related to the pandemic, not related to COVID, that had to be canceled as a result of this overwhelming volume of need for ICU beds, also affected other people. We can't let that happen again. And if Doug Ford has another 4 years, I really fear that that's what's going to happen in the future.
May I suggest, and maybe you can comment on, in other words, if I'm hearing you right, is as a government, we need to respect existing frameworks and the ones that exist rather than destroy them, and also continue to create frameworks in the event. I mean, these are the frameworks that I think you're referring to, and if I understand you correctly, that we need to build these frameworks and maintain them in the event that something happens. And sometimes things get a little exaggerated because you want to save a couple of dollars, and then what happens? See, because you want to save some money and then you destroy the framework. How do you ensure the frameworks are maintained? Because you're saying they were there and now they're gone. What have we learned, and what have you learned, and what does the Liberal Party has learned to ensure that whoever takes over understands the importance of these frameworks that are together for future, like insurance, I guess is the word I'm grappling for.
Well, it's I think that when you get rid of something, it's not available to you, right? If it's still there in some fashion, then it can be resorted to, number one, and secondly, if necessary, modified. But you don't have to then build it again from scratch. And that, there's almost a certain sinister element to it, because it's almost the assumption that other people's viewpoints don't matter. So the previous administration had the belief that they needed to be in a position to respond to something in case it happened. And then the current administration basically said, we don't really care about that. We're going to roll the dice, and we're going to hope that it doesn't happen. But they roll the dice and people die. That's the issue here. And I'm not suggesting that we have to build and throw money at this framework, but let's keep it intact so that it can be responded to and used, so that things like that which happened in the pandemic will not happen again, or at least will be responded to quickly enough so that people's lives will be saved, not sacrificed.
You're speaking to the words that you started with, which is the future. And the future, the future has different levels, right? There's tomorrow, there's next week, there's next month, there's 10 years down the road, there's 50 years down the road. The pandemic issue is something that didn't happen for 100 years. So we can't assume it's not going to happen because it hasn't happened in 100 years. I guess you're suggesting we should have that framework there. All right, any other long-term issues?
Well, can I just comment on that last little statement that you made? That's not entirely true, Frank. I mean, we had SARS, we had the Asian flu, we had minor pandemics upon which guys like Bill Gates said, you know what, we were lucky with respect to them. The means of transmission wasn't as serious. But when you have a means of transmission that's airborne, you up the ante. The issue is much stronger, and the ability to transfer it, as we have seen, is exponentially higher. So you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and you've got to maintain your ability to respond. One of the biggest and most important elements of any administration is the protection and safety of its citizens. And by throwing out something that might be a tool to protect that most sacred of a government's obligations, I think I'm thinking of a word rather than criminal, but it's certainly borderline with respect to that. Well, anyway, there are other questions I see on the screen here, so it's up to you. It's your show, but I'm happy to answer all of them.
I think we spoke that. We can leave it there. At the end of the day, the bottom line is, whether it's a week, a month, what I was trying to say was, it doesn't matter how long. The future is something you have to keep an eye on,
absolutely,
regardless of the timeline. So that's important. When it comes to housing and people being able to afford to live, one of the biggest problems we have today, the biggest challenges that governments have, is affordable housing for people. How do you see the Liberal Party helping in that regard?
Well, it's interesting because today on my canvas, I happened to knock on the door of somebody who's a realtor, and not necessarily, committed to the Liberal Party, but nevertheless, I'm hoping that the discussion that I had with him was helpful. But his position was, and it really aligns with the position of the Ontario Liberal Party, and I think generally speaking, those people who are interested in this particular issue, supply is a major factor with respect to prices, and we need to maximize the supply of affordable housing units. We need to maximize the supply of units and houses in the real estate sector in order to bring down prices. What's happening now, both intentionally and non-intentionally, is even though there are units being built, right, these are not units which are meant to be within that affordable housing spectrum, and we are not ensuring that those people that there's free access to or open access to those particular units on an ongoing basis. So there are a lot of units that are built that are sort of taken up by speculators. They're held for a long period of time, and which drives up the prices. I think we need to have, and I think the federal government has taken initiative with respect to the last budget in a way which I think will be helpful. But Doug Ford has not been helpful with respect to this, because he's allowed development to continue without a major focus, if any, on building affordable units and making sure that these units are available so that people can access them, purchase them, and thereby maintain or increase the supply to meet the demand.
Affordability also has to do with existing homes, right?
Well, for sure,
So,
but
that's one of the problems as well, right? That the skyrocketing, you know, it's a good and bad situation. There are people who I own a home. I love the idea that my house is getting more valuable every day.
Mhm.
That's fantastic. But for somebody who isn't on that, I'll call it a merry-go-round yet, you know, it's hard to get on. So your proposition is to help first-time home buyers, and if
Yes,
I have that
exactly.
right, right?
Yeah.
And first-time home buyers that are trying to start a life. Like we have a lot of young families, and it not necessarily families here. I don't want to sound like I'm favoring families, but young families that have a child, to have a home and not live in an apartment is an important issue to families, and as far as raising. So you're trying to create an environment for people to live uh, a better life, because how else, housing, how about employment? I mean, that's an important issue, you know, as far as people. I'm one of those. I'm old enough to remember my parents bought a home for $18,000. My dad was earning $6,000 a year. 6 times 3 is 18,000. That means in 3 years he earned, didn't keep, but he earned enough money to buy a house. Today, that's not true. We're talking, if you live in Toronto, $800,000, you know, for 3 years. That means you have to earn almost 250, $270,000 a year to be able to have, you know, enough money
Mhm.
that you earn. So is it reversible? Is there an opportunity to create you know, opportunities for young people to buy homes? Because that's who we're talking about here. We're talking about our present day workers, our present families, single or married, doesn't matter, people trying to live.
Yes, I think absolutely there is. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but I think that the steps that need to be taken can be taken relatively soon towards moving in that direction. So, and I think you hit the nail on the head in many respects when you talked about a first time buyer. When I first came to Toronto, I bought a house in York Centre. It was a starter house, and it was an affordable starter house. And this was when interest rates were double digit,
Mm.
and builders were giving 3-year mortgages at relatively low cost, although even more so than they are now. But nevertheless, in terms of the mortgage. But nevertheless, it was a starter house. I think we have to focus on the idea of building starter units so that young families can start, that move up the ladder, if you will, without having to bankrupt themselves initially or basically be out of the market in totally. So I think that's part of it. But the biggest issue to me, I mean, it's extremely important, and I want that that affordability issue to be addressed. But it's the idea of communities. When I knock on doors, what I hear is that, especially the older population in York Centre, they're concerned about maintaining their communities intact. And if you have a situation where if you sell your house, such as yours, which is increased in value, but then you have to go 50, 60, 70, 80 miles north or south, or well, it can't be south, but west or east in order to afford a house, that community no longer exists, right? We want to build communities where people have a consistency, where generations grow up together, where it's an actual community, where you know your neighbors, where you live with your neighbors, you cherish your neighbors, and you can't have that without affordable housing. So there needs to be a plan. There needs to be a plan which focuses on this, and we do not have that with Doug Ford. We do not have that, but we will have that with a Liberal government.
You know, owning a home is getting to be the same thing's true with education. You know, the upfront investment is very difficult to achieve. So you have to borrow money. As a student, I mean, OSAP is the greatest thing ever. Every student I know is grateful that that exists, or they would not be able to get an
Mhm.
education.
Mhm.
Are you referring to something similar to that? Do you see, you know, I'm not telling the Liberal Party what to do, but there has to be some way of economically making it feasible for somebody to make a commitment to a home without having the 75, 80, 90, 100, $200,000 upfront investment.
Well, yeah, I think that this is a multifaceted issue, and there has to be, because it's been, a problem for so long, and it has actually thrown communities apart, not as long, but too long. That we need to really focus on what all the opportunities and all the options are in terms of trying to redress this particular problem. So whatever structure can help to make it easier for people, younger people in particular, to be able to uh, save money, and such as this new tax-free account that the federal government has suggested. It may not be extensive enough to really deal with what the reality of a down payment is, but the concept is great, and we have to build on those things. We have to look at them. We have to be resilient. We have to be creative, and quite frankly, throwing it open to the marketplace clearly shows that the opposite effect is happening, right? We now
Oh,
have
absolutely.
situations where the supply doesn't exist anymore and prices are going up. So we need to have input from all stakeholders. We need to have people who are sensitive to this particular issue to provide their suggestions. And quite frankly, the Ontario Liberal Party has been engaged in a policy initiative for the last 10 months. And I think you'll see some really interesting suggestions come out. But that's not the end of the equation. We have to continue making it easier. We still have to continue thinking about other alternatives.
Oh, okay. So, like, a reasonable, affordable mortgage that allows people who are more than willing to commit to long-term investment that a home is, not just because they have a family, but because they want to have a home. Two people who aren't married, everybody who wants to have a home. I just don't believe what I've learned in my life is that everybody has a large majority of people have house pride and it creates value within themselves,
Hmm.
where it makes them not just productive, it makes them feel like they're productive and part of society, a good part of society. It is truly something that makes one feel really good about themselves when they have something like that that's theirs. So anything the Liberal Party can do for that, I'm sure, and I'm speaking for those kinds of people because I'm the other person you were referring to. I live where I live now, in Wasaga Beach because I could afford to buy a house here as a
Hmm.
senior, and I
Hmm.
could move here and afford to buy a house and have it manageable, whereas I could not have done it in Toronto in by any stretch of the imagination. I could not have. So there are, and I'm hearing this is a disappearing opportunity as well. So you speak the truth when you talk about there's hardly anywhere. So all right, well, housing is an important issue for you and the Liberal Party. I'm more interested in what you think. I understand the Liberal Party fortunately agrees with you. So housing is very important. We talked a little bit about employment. Ontario, for years, was the driving force in this country. Some have joked in recent years that it's a have not province for whatever reason. How do you see economically that Ontario can do better? We know that with green energy, that's something that Ontario has an equal opportunity to anywhere else in the country to excel in that. How important is that to you?
It's extremely important. And it goes back to what we started with, and that is the future and education as the foundation to make sure that the future is viable and something that we can benefit from. And so, the green economy is inevitable, regardless of how we drag our feet, how we try and look back to to the past and look at the fossil fuels and worry about oil and everything else, which clearly is an issue because there are people whose livelihoods depend upon that. I'm not trying to, soft pedal that issue, but nevertheless, the future is green energy. And so we need to have a population that is um, educated to get the jobs that are necessary, educated to be creative, to make sure that whatever the future holds and whatever industries come up relating to green energy are ones that will stay in Ontario, that want to make Ontario their home, where we get the good jobs that are going to be generated as a result of that. And we need to do that in the public school system as much as in the private school system. I mean, the vast majority of students are going to be in the public school system. People who are going to invest in Ontario want to know that they're going to have a workforce and an administrative force and a creative force, right, a research and development force that will be able to make use of these new technologies, this new economy in a way that is going to benefit them in Ontario. If you build it that way, this type of investment will come. It's almost axiomatic. I don't even know why we're even talking about it. It just makes sense. But you don't have, what you don't have in the Ford government is a plan to make sure that there are charging stations everywhere. You don't have a group of people that are focusing on what's going to happen in the future in terms of windmills, in terms of solar energy, in terms of all of those things that are necessary to be brought to Ontario so that we can benefit from this going forward. That's what's critical here, and that's what we're not going to get if we have another 4 years of Ford.
Well, the reality is that, I look at fossil fuels as an old friend, and I know, my old friend sometimes feels like I'm looking to replace them, and they don't like it. It's something that they don't want. The insecurity kicks in hard and fast, right? But the fact remains, maybe we have to figure out a way to make a better connection between the two, because as you know, and as everyone knows who's paying attention, the transition from fossil fuels to green needs to be a better handoff than it looks like at this immediate moment. If the pandemic has taught us a lot of things, now this war in the Ukraine has taught us some other things as well, where the realities of life are kicking in. Are you willing to accept the fact that fossil fuels at this time, there's a rethink going on because of the second most available oil comes from Russia, and everybody's turning that tap off? The reality of maybe fossil fuels, for now we have to pick the lesser of two evils, maybe.
Well, I firstly, my whole premise is such that I don't. I think that it's inevitable, as I said, that fossil fuels will be a footnote in history at some point in time, but that's not the case now. And we also have to react to the realities that are confronting us. And one of the realities is that because of what's happening in the Ukraine, a lot of the supplies of all sorts of other energy sources are limited. We also want to make sure that, apparently at the federal level, it's not the provincial level that's dealing with this particular issue, but that whatever difficulties we can throw in Vladimir Putin's way, right, will make it more difficult, if not impossible, for him to continue this war. So if one of those things is to, refer back to fossil fuels and see what other areas we can source them from, including Alberta, so be it. It's a temporary thing. But truthfully, I think that those people who recognize that ultimately, forget about the Ukraine for the moment, forget about the immediacy of the situation, ultimately is going to be, prehistoric, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're doing a favor to the people in the country, because if the ultimate fuel supply is going to be green energy of whatever nature, then those people who are now relying on fossil fuels will be in a very difficult position if they don't make the transition as well. And we have an obligation, I think, because they have helped to maintain our standard of living and our position. We have an obligation to them to make sure that their transition is made as easy as possible, because it's going to benefit all of us. To me, this sort of compartmentalization of areas of industry and what's going to happen in the future and who gets benefit from what is not helpful. We need to know that we're all in this together, and then that whatever handout or hand we give to one side is something that's going to benefit everybody. And so, yes, I think we have to work with people in Alberta, people in the fossil fuel industry. I think we need to do all of those things together, because we're all going to benefit from the transition that's going to happen in the future.
I want to remind the folks that are watching, we're with Shelley Brown, who is vying for the position of MPP for York Centre as a Liberal. And one of the things is that's become apparent as well. The unintended consequence of what happened in Russia around the world and here in Ontario too, because to specify that in the context of Ontario, um, we know that the unintended consequence that leader had on the rest of the world, he's done things that have now pushed faster the issues that we all want to advance, which is our independence from oil,
Mhm.
greenhouse gases, our independence from people who are dictators and bullies. It's had that kind of effect. We talked. The reason I say this now is we talked before the program started. You and I were talking about how there are no problems. There's just opportunities. I'm paraphrasing. Uh, this is an opportunity for Ontario and the world and Canada as a whole, where green is a good idea because I think wholly, the more independent everybody can be from others, the more peace there'll be in the world because we won't have dependency. When there's dependencies, there's you owe me, and sometimes you owe me is a debt no one wants to pay. So, how important
Mhm.
is independence for Ontario? Is this another reason why green is good, and why how does the independence of Ontario fit into your thinking, and how we can make ourselves more independent?
Well, it's a two-edged sword, truthfully, what you've just postulated. I do think that under certain circumstances, especially when you have an authoritarian autocrat who is not ready to worry about how it's going to impact everybody else, including himself, by the way, and his
Hmm.
population, his citizens, um, that's a very unique type of situation. If he's not ready to worry about all of those particular issues, then really the rule book is thrown out the door. So under those circumstances, we see it can happen. We need to be, as we should have been in terms of this pandemic, we need to be prepared for all sorts of outcomes and alternatives. One of which is to make sure that, God forbid this happens again. Hopefully it'll end soon, but God forbid it happens again. We'll be in a position to be able to pivot to other things that will make it make it less impactful, and hopefully make our independence self realized. Right, we don't have to worry about anybody else. That probably can happen in certain areas and up to a certain point, but I think the way the world is now, it's a virtual impossibility forever. And so we also then have to work hard to ensure that these types of circumstances where you have this type of autocrat, this type of person who doesn't care about norms or the impact on his own population, we can react in a way which minimizes that potential from happening. And also, not only that, but be sensitive to the indications that these things are in his mind or her mind, right?
Right.
Although I think the argument would be that it's much less likely that it would be a woman who would do something like this. But nevertheless, we have to be concerned about all these things and be able to take the steps before these happen. Take the preventative measures before these things happen. And we know in this
Framework
particular
again.
instance, we had a
Framework
lot
again.
of pre-knowledge, right? There was a
Yep.
lot of indication that these types of things might happen. So, we
Yeah.
just have to have smarter people at the helm. We have to have people who are aware that you learn from the past. Santayana said that those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. Doomed to repeat it. Well, we have to learn. We
Yeah.
have to be able to respond better.
Well, the pandemic has taught us, and so has this issue, independence. And when I say independence, I don't mean shutting yourself off from the rest of the world, but maybe ensuring that we're self-supportive, which
Mhm.
goes to employment, which goes to housing, right? We're looking for, I guess what I hear from you is you want to promote the idea of independence. By independence, I mean our ability to function as individuals and not necessarily be reliant, which is why I had that hand up, hand out, you're on your own type thing,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
So,
mhm.
if people given an opportunity, what another definition of what you want is to give Ontarians an opportunity to show that they can take care of things that meet the challenges that are out there when it comes to housing, when it comes to energy. When it comes to something very special and dear to your heart was our social rights and stuff like that. We haven't
Mhm.
talked about, socially speaking, how can Ontario improve socially with the Liberal Party in this upcoming election, in your opinion? If we can
Well,
move on from the other stuff.
okay, let's put that behind us. I think, and I mentioned this before, the Liberal Party, if you just take a look at the people that are running, it's reflective of the population in Ontario, and therefore all of these sensitivities, all of these concerns, all of these issues that are significant to them are going to be brought out in caucus, in government. Hopefully, if we become the government, so that it's not a question of having to have. I mean, obviously, we're going to be more open to listening to a wider swath of people because we represent a wider swath of people. That's the first thing. The second thing also is that it's going to be easier for people to approach us and to know that we have a group of people who have, at least in some area of their caucus, an understanding of their struggles, an understanding of their concerns, and therefore that dialogue will be a lot easier. And as a result of that, the social issues that are significant to me and that I've dealt with during my profession will be taken care of because they will be voiced. They will not have to be constantly the issue of litigation all the time. I think that's very important. Dialogue is critical. Sensitivity is critical. Empathy is critical in order to deal with these particular issues. And I can tell you that the Liberal Party has it in spades.
Now, we've got a couple of minutes left. Have you written any new songs lately?
Actually, no. It's really unfortunate. I decided that I would become a lawyer when I met my wife, and I did that because I didn't think that she would be interested in marrying a musician who was still hopefully maybe not struggling, but nevertheless. So I then applied to law at McGill, and the moment I got accepted, from that moment on, I never wrote another song.
Well,
So
that's too bad. I hope we didn't lose a wonderful example and or something that I could be humming right now. I hope
well,
you haven't denied me of that.
you know what they say is when one door closes, another one opens. Hopefully, we'll have an
Absolutely.
MPP that will make up for that deficiency.
That's fantastic. Okay, in the final 2 minutes that we have here, give us where people can contact you, and so that we can help you to, get connected and give you the best opportunity to get elected as possible.
I appreciate that, Frank. So, one of the biggest issues here is volunteers. So, shelleybrown.ca is my website. And it's very simple. My name.ca. We have, my past, my future, hopefully, and everything else that represents what we're doing on that website. And so please get in touch with us that way. Our phone number is, or at least my phone number is 647-712-1952. It's my campaign phone number. Please feel free to give it a call. But shelleybrown.ca should get you there. And we'd love to have you volunteer. We have a lot of fun. It's really, really worthwhile. I think that we need to have this change. So get involved. And thank you, Frank, for this opportunity.
And in case he doesn't answer, I'm sure Kerry Miller will.
Oh, yeah, he's definitely proactive. Definitely.
Tell Kerry thank you for helping us with doing this and connecting with you. Really appreciate it.
Will do. And thank you again, Frank. Have a wonderful Easter. Take care.
And a happy Passover to you.
Thank you.
For Shelley Brown, Ontario Liberal candidate for York Centre, I'm candidate Frank Stanishi. Thank you for watching Open Forum. This program can be seen live on Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The show can also be heard on the Spanglish World Radio Network. For Open Forum, other news, entertainment, and sports programming we offer, please check out spanglishworld.ca. Spanglish World. Watch it, hear it, read it, download it, and thank you for watching. Until next week. Good luck, Shelley.
Thank you.